news, so I'm not sure if it's true. Is it true? Is it Councillor Fadeco's birthday today?
But I'm 10 years younger than what you think I am.
I wasn't going to disclose age because I'm not sure myself, but I just want to say happy birthday, Marnie.
Thank you.
And it means a lot that you would spend your special night with council and the community of Cochrane. So,
Who else would I spend it with at this point?
so happy birthday.
Thank you.
That said, we'll recess the meeting and move right into our public hearings. First public hearing, Bylaw 01-2020, Land Use Bylaw Amendment, Textual Amendment. Ms. Crosbie.
Hello.
Good evening. First to four. Oh, there we go.
All right, good evening, Mayor and members of Council. Tonight I will be presenting Administration's Public Hearing Report for Bylaw 01-2020. The bylaw being proposed is a textual amendment to ensure site-specific permitted and discretionary uses in the Central Business District for lots 2, 3, 4, Block H, Plan 4810L, civically known as 308, 312, and 316, First Street East, located in the East End, are consistent. In July of 2019, Council approved Bylaw 2019 to rezone Lot 4 from Residential High Density District R2X to the Central Business District CB, with additional amendments to exclude hotels from permitted uses and entertainment establishments, motels, and repair and service shops from discretionary uses, and adding Lot 4 to Section 2152 special requirements. In 2017, the two parcels to the west of Lot 4, shown on the map, Lots 2 and 3, were rezoned Central Business District through Bylaw 31-2017 without exceptions. All three parcels, being Lot 2, 3, and 4, have the Central Business District zoning. However, only Lot 4 has specific land use exceptions. Administration is proposing to amend the site-specific hotels listed in the permitted use and the entertainment establishment, motels, and repair and service shops listed in the discretionary use, and the special requirements in Section 2152 are consistent across all three lots. Administration has reviewed the bylaw amendment through the town's statutory planning documents. The land use bylaw textual amendment supports the Cochrane strategic plan, sustainable community building. Together we create a complete community through a balance of environmental, economic, and social infrastructures. The Cochrane sustainability plan, Pathway 6, our economy is diverse. Pathway 10, there's enough room for everything a community should have. And Pathway 11, wherever you are in Cochrane, you are close and connected. It also supports the municipal development plan adopted by Council in 2008, Section 1.3, Planning Principles and Goals. Principle 4, Economic Vitality, provides the foundation for a healthy, diverse, active, prosperous, and resilient economy. The Economic Development Goals, to attract businesses that will diversify Cochrane's economy and create career opportunities, support the economic vitality of the downtown, and encourage all businesses to stay and expand in the community. As well as 8.2 land use goals to ensure to use the existing land base efficiently and provide opportunities for creative use of land. The purpose of intent of the CB district in the land use bylaw is to provide for pedestrian-oriented commercial developments serving the town and surrounding areas. The uses will be those that promote the downtown as Cochrane's primary area of community, social interaction, and a focus of civic and cultural identity. The bylaw amendment was circulated to the East End Community Association and landowners of the affected lots. No concerns were brought forward. CPC was given the opportunity to provide comments for Council's consideration at their meeting on January the 15th. CPC wanted to recognize the efforts made by Council to exclude certain provisions on lots 2 and 3 that were triggered by discussion in relation to Lot 4, Block H, Plan 4810L, which were brought up this past summer by the Cochrane Planning Commission. CPC is in favor of the land use bylaw amendment in relation to the site-specific permitted and discretionary uses. Administration has confirmed that the public hearing has been advertised in the January 16th and 23rd paper, and there are no other submissions to be noted at this time. Our recommended action is that Council receive and consider all comments presented during the public hearing for Bylaw 01-2020. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. Council, any questions of administration? Just have one. Just to be clear, so the adjacent two lots, we are just changing the land use to align with the other two that we did previously.
That's correct.
Yeah. And those uses explicitly are hotels, bars, what were the three
So in the
major?
permitted uses, it's hotels, and in the discretionary uses, it's entertainment establishments, motels, and repair and service shops.
Right. Okay, thank you. And this is a town-led application?
This is,
So there
yes,
is
done
no-
through administration,
Yeah,
correct?
okay. And is there a speakers list? No? Is there anyone in the gallery that wishes to speak for or against this particular hearing? Oh, sorry, Marnie, Councilor Federico, birthday girl?
I have one quick question. I know that it was supposed to be a medical center, or that was kind of the idea. Is that still the same idea? That's what's coming forward, or do we know that, or has the plan changed for that lot?
So through the chair, yes, as far as I know, that is still the plan. I have not received any formal application at this point in time to confirm what the applicant is looking to do or what the landowner is going to do.
Does that application come back to council for us to be able to review, or at this point, you know, if this does pass, does that remove council from that procedure and then we just move on into, you know, whatever is a permitted use?
Yes, so the application, so through the chair, if the application comes forward, it wouldn't go to council for approval on that. It would be either approved through administration if it was a permitted use, and if it was a discretionary use, then it would go to the Cochrane Planning Commission for approval.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, no other questions? Last call for the gallery? No, any closing remarks? Okay, we'll close that public hearing and move on to second one. Bylaw 2, thank you, Ms. Crosbie. 02-2020, Land Use Bylaw Amendment, Day Homes. Appears we have some. Mr. Welden.
Yes. Okay, good evening, Mayor Janung and members of council. I'd like to present to you Bylaw 2, 2020, which is a textual amendment to our land use bylaw, specifically related to day homes for public hearing tonight. I'll start with a bit of background. This is an administratively led textual amendment to our land use bylaw, which was identified as a priority outside of our land use bylaw review project. And the proposed amendment is town-wide, which means that it will be applied to all communities within Cochrane. The project rationale is that it was an identified need in the community, and there were a number of process barriers to day homes, to starting up and operating within the town. Some of which are the application itself requiring to go through a permit process, the cost of the application, which is currently $250, the time needed to process the application, which could be up to 2 to 3 months, and the uncertainty of approval, given that currently day homes are a home-based business major and are a discretionary use listed in our land use bylaw, which provides the opportunity for an appeal. Also, secondly, some of our regulations, namely the requirements for parking, were seen as an additional barrier to the day homes being approved within the town. So the purpose of this amendment is to help eliminate these barriers for day home operators while still ensuring that appropriate provisions are in place to regulate day homes. As of January 1st of this year, there were a total of 229 development permits that had been applied for and 219 development permits that were issued within the town for day homes. So currently, as I mentioned earlier, day homes are considered a home-based business major. They do have specific regulations related to day homes itself. As a home-based business major, they are listed as a discretionary use in our land use bylaw in our residential districts. Now, the proposal, in terms of a definition in land use, we are proposing that day homes become a standalone use. And so what I mean by that is it would be not considered a home-based business major, but would rather be its own standalone use within our land use bylaw. Doing so will allow us to add it to districts as that standalone use. So we are proposing a new definition for the land use bylaw for day homes to mean an accessory use within a dwelling unit that may provide temporary care, maintenance, supervision, or education for up to 6 children. Now, our land use bylaw currently does have a definition and a standalone use for childcare services. So there is a difference between a day home and childcare services. Our current definition for childcare services means development used to provide temporary care and supervision to 7 or more children under the age of 14 for periods less than 24 hours in accordance with the Child Care Licensing Act, and this is key, and may include daycare facilities, play schools, and preschools, but does not include home-based business majors for a day home. So they distinguish between a day home and childcare services. But there was a bit of an issue referring to the Child Care Licensing Act here in Alberta. And let me explain. We recently had an example of a kindergarten that is currently operating within the town and wanted to expand. Now, they are defined as childcare services within our land use bylaw. However, they are not regulated under the Child Care Child Care Licensing Act. So as a result, they do not meet the definition from a very technical point of view, but they do not meet the definition of childcare services. So even though the intent of childcare services was to provide for preschools and kindergartens and as such, they are regulated under a separate act, that's the Education Act in Alberta. So we are proposing to delete any reference to the provincial acts as a requirement or as a definition for childcare services within the town. So for the town's purposes, it must meet our definition for the town's purposes or for land use purposes. So the new definition means a development that may provide temporary care, maintenance, supervision, or education to 7 or more children under the age of 14 for periods of less than 24 hours and may include daycare facilities, play schools, preschools, and kindergartens, but does not include a day home. So twofold, to delete that reference to the Child Care Licensing Act, or any act for that matter, and to allow for that distinction between day homes and child care services. So with day homes being a stand-alone use and defined separately in our land use bylaw, that will allow us to add it to for consideration in specific districts. So we are proposing that day homes become a permitted use in all of our residential districts and 2 of our commercial districts, which are the Commercial Heritage Mixed Use District and our Commercial Residential District, as well as our Urban Reserve District and our Urban Reserve Residential District. As a permitted use, as I mentioned earlier, it means that this use is appropriate for all lots that have this zoning or this land use district applied to it. And it greatly reduces, if not eliminates, as long as the regulations are being adhered to, the opportunity for an appeal to a decision for a day home or the operation of a day home. Now, secondly, we're also proposing to add day homes to the list of development permits not requiring a permit. So what this means is that they would no longer be required to make an application to the town and go through our process. It is a permitted use if it is accepted, and they would no longer need to go through that process. They could start operating as long as they're still conforming to the regulations of the land use bylaw. So basically, they don't have to go through a development permit process or pay that fee for any future day homes. Now for the regulations. We are stipulating a few regulations. The first of which is that the dwelling unit associated with the day home shall contain no other day home, home-based business major, bed and breakfast, and no more than one other home-based business minor currently operating within the dwelling unit. So what this means is that you have the residence as the principal use, and then you would have the day home as the accessory use. No other accessory residential use, such as a home-based business major, a bed and breakfast, or day home or another day home would be allowed to operate within that residence. It would only be for that day home. And just so you know the difference between a home-based business major, because we do say that you can operate a home-based business minor. A home-based business minor is simply a room that is used for office purposes. No clients or no sales or any external impact would be evident from the dwelling unit. Secondly, employees working at the day home shall be limited to the residence of the dwelling unit. So what that means is there's no external employees that can come to the day home to provide services. So ultimately, the people operating the day home must reside in the residence, and they can't have any external employees coming to the residence. And no form of on-site advertising related to the business may be discernible from outside of the dwelling except for one identification sign with a maximum area of 0.12 square meters displayed in the window. That is an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and that is used for identification for safety purposes for emergency services if there was ever a need. Also proposed with this bylaw amendment is the removal of the requirement for a designated drop-off and pick-up parking stall. So there would be no longer the requirement to have that parking stall on the site, and that people using the services would be parking on the street. We did do a comparison to other municipalities within the region, and I'd just like to go through this chart. So we have our own regulations on the left-hand side. We also looked at Leduc, Airdrie, Okotoks, Calgary, Edmonton, St. Albert, Chestermere, Medicine Hat, and Canmore. And I'll just go through them here fairly quickly. So we have ours here. We have, is there a development permit required? Is it a permitted use? Is there an employee restriction? And is there a requirement for an additional parking space required? So currently, Cochrane, we require a permit. It is not a permitted use, so it's a discretionary use. We do restrict employees currently. Is there an additional parking space required? Yes, we do require that one of the existing stalls be used for pickup and drop-off. Now, compared with the other municipalities, Leduc just acknowledges day homes that they do not require a permit and then don't stipulate any other regulations at all. So they can just operate. Airdrie, they do require a development permit. It is a permitted use, however, and there is no other employee restriction or additional parking space. Okotoks does not require a development permit. It is a permitted use, and they don't have a restriction. Is there an employee restriction? No, and there is no additional parking. Okotoks, no DP is required. It is a permitted use, so same as Airdrie. Calgary there's no development permit required. It is a permitted use. There is a restriction, like us, for employee coming to the site, and there is no additional parking required. Edmonton and St. Albert don't address it at all, meaning that it is 100% acceptable. They just allow day homes to occur. Chestermere, they only acknowledge day homes in their land use bylaw, saying that they don't need a development permit, same as Medicine Hat. They don't need a development permit, but then don't have any additional regulations. Canmore was the most restrictive out of all the comparison municipalities with requiring a development permit. It is a discretionary use like Cochrane is now currently. They do have a restriction for employees, and they don't have additional parking space, or they don't require an additional parking space. We did a review of our statutory and non-statutory documents. It is compatible and adheres to our Cochrane Sustainability Plan, specifically with Pathway 1, 6, 7, 8, and 11. I'm not going to go through this. There was public consultation. There was 2 surveys for public input prior to drafting the bylaw that was open to the general public, as well as specifically to day home providers. There was a total of 209 responses, which was really good. Those responses were included in the What We Heard report that was attached to your report. It was also circulated for comments to both internal and external agencies, as well as the community associations. And the draft regulations were posted on Let's Talk Cochrane for public comment. We also did hold a realtor forum in December of this year, and we also presented this to them as well. This was also presented to the Cochrane Planning Commission at their meeting on January 15th of this year. The comments were as follows. They believe that it's a step in the right direction. They were happy to have brought this forward ahead of the land use bylaw review project. They had discussion around removing the one designated pickup and drop-off stall. They could open up the discussion for not restricting an additional worker as well, so not restricting the employee coming to the site. Pleased to see this usage will have less red tape in terms of process. And there was a discussion surrounding the text of whether we need to state 6 children per day or if that could be increased. The recommendation tonight is option 1, that Council receives and considers all comments presented at the public hearing for Bylaw 2, 2020. And that concludes my presentation. Be happy to answer any of your questions.
Okay, thank you. Council, questions of administration. Councillor Reid.
Thanks, Riley, for the presentation. Do you know if the Child Care Licensing Act requires that there be more than one adult for 6 children?
Through the chair to Councillor Reid, I don't know specifically if they do. I do believe there is a representative from our Cochrane Play Days here that would probably be in a better position to answer that in terms of provincial regulation. So I would likely have to defer to her. Yeah.
Okay, I had an additional question if I could. How would we police these day homes if they have employees that have a vehicle and create a potential parking problem? Mm-hmm. And then secondly, what is the penalty if the bylaw is violated?
That's a good question. Through the mayor to Councillor Reid. So firstly, with your question regarding how would we police this, we would rely on complaints. So it would be a complaint-based enforcement. Currently, there would be no, as the bylaw is presented, there would be no employees that would be allowed on the site. So if we did receive a complaint, we would send it to our enforcement services, who would then investigate to see if there is employees. We would work with them to get them into compliance. Ultimately, if they did not comply, there would be a fine ultimately given to the day home operator. And that fine is, I believe, I'm not entirely sure exactly how much it would be. I can get that answer to you in second and third reading, but there would be a nominal fee or fine that would be associated. But we always try to work with the operator to get them into compliance first, and it would just have to be more of a blatant disregard if they continue. Yeah.
So it would just be a fine, but they wouldn't lose their license?
So we don't deal with licenses unless it's a business license. So, excuse me, so the town of Cochrane does require a business license for day homes, just to be clear. But in terms of their license with the province, we wouldn't have any jurisdiction over their provincial license.
Yeah, I was referring to the business license.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Would they lose that?
That's a good question. I would have to look at how we deal with our business licenses in terms of whether we have the ability to revoke a business license due to that. But again, I can get you that answer.
Okay, thank you.
Another time.
Okay, Councillor Federico?
I only have one question for you. When it comes to, you know, before, if you were a discretionary business or whatever, your neighbor had an opportunity, if you'd have to post a sign or whatever, they could voice a complaint whether or not they wanted to have that business next door. Now, what happens now if it becomes a permitted business and there's no opportunity? What happens to those neighbors that maybe say, you know, they have concerns about parking, maybe they have concerns about noise, maybe they have concerns about how many children you have? What is the process for them to be able to bring that forward? We all know childcare is a big issue in this town, so I don't want to necessarily say that I'm not for this, but for those people who are opposed for a variety of reasons, what kind of course can they take when it comes to this?
Another good question through the mayor to Councillor Federico. In what the bylaw that we are proposing would, as a permitted use, and then taking away, or not taking away, but not requiring a development permit, would ultimately mean that there would be no opportunity for an appeal. And there would be no opportunity for input into the development permit because there would be no development permit that would be required. What we're saying is that day homes are an acceptable use within the residential areas within Cochrane, and that the impacts that result from this day home use, which may include, you mentioned a couple, noise from kids that are playing in the yard, and maybe some parking that is, in our opinion, quite minimal due to the pickup and the drop-off nature of this operation, that we are saying that it is an acceptable use. But you touch on a good point in terms of the appeals. We did look into the number of appeals over the years for day homes specifically. There have been. And every appeal that has gone to the Subdivision and Development Appeal Board was overturned, meaning that that the day home was allowed to proceed and the development permit was issued. So what that tells us as administration, whenever we see a pattern of that, is that we need to look at our regulations. So there's something wrong with our regulations, and that this should be looked at.
Perfect. I'm glad to hear that, because I know that it becomes easy for somebody to voice a complaint without actually knowing what's going on next door. So I'm glad to hear that. And we all know, as Cochrane's a growing community, that we need more places to offer care. So it's good to hear.
Great. Thank you.
Councillor Flowers?
Okay, thank you for the info. It seems pretty straightforward. The only question I had was about the absolute no employees on site, because if there's only one caregiver and they have an appointment outside the home or they're sick or whatever, they may need to bring someone in. Was there any discussion around that?
Through the mayor to Councillor Flowers, yeah, we did look into that. We looked into what other municipalities were doing, kind of in a best practice sort of perspective. And as I showed earlier, there were a number of municipalities that did restrict the employees, and a lot of that had to do with when you have that additional person coming to the home. You know, you have the requirement for the parking and that sort of thing, and so yeah, so that's where that regulation comes from and restriction comes from.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm thinking it wouldn't be additional if the person was away at an appointment or had to leave the home.
Right, and that gets a little difficult to try to regulate in terms of the land use bylaw. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councillor Wilson?
Just a quick one to piggyback off Councillor Flowers' question there. So if I'm running a day home and there's 6 kids and just the residents of the house there to administer it, if I want to go to 7 kids and bring in a outside help, then it becomes a home-based business major, is that?
Through the mayor to Councillor Wilson, not quite, but close. Yeah, we do have the standalone childcare services use, so it wouldn't be a home-based business major, but it would rather be a childcare services. So that is that distinction between childcare services and a day home.
And so I just had a question about how that happens. You have to apply for a development permit, and what is the approximate cost of that, and what is the? process with that?
I believe the cost for childcare services would be our normal residential application fee of $400.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it would just be that blanket fee.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I've got a couple questions. You touched on the up to 6 children. Was there any discussion, I heard from CPC that there was maybe a brief discussion around increasing that number. My question is around, and I had a day home provider speak with me about regulations around having 6 children per day or 6 visits per day. Mm-hmm. Is there an opportunity, or was this discussed, that you could have 6 at a time regardless of the visits?
Yes, Mayor Janung, we did consider this. When you consider 6 children at a time, and there's a distinction. I know, even though it doesn't seem like it is a distinction, but if you were to have 6 children at a time, say in the morning, as opposed to the afternoon, you have to think of it in terms of overall impact as a result of the number of vehicle trips related. So you would have those vehicle trips in the morning for drop-off and then pick up again in that morning, and in the afternoon it would be the similar, it would be over again. So we're looking at this that it would be the 6 children per day total. Okay. Not in the morning or have that distinction.
And the distinction was all around vehicle trips?
That was part of the discussion, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Flowers talked about the external employees. I see that in your comparison to other communities, there are a number of them that actually don't have any restrictions. Mm-hmm. Why are we going the route of more restrictions rather than similar to other communities that just allow?
That's a good question. Now, a lot of the other municipalities have gone, completely no regulations whatsoever. And looking at where we are coming from in this, in the community of Cochrane, and what we've been used to in terms of having a very regulated process and a lot of very specific regulations, we thought that this was the appropriate regulations to apply to the community.
Okay. And then obviously there's provincial regulations in place. Those are always going to trump our regulations. All day homes would have to follow the province?
No, actually. Not all day homes will be required to have a license through the province. And again, I might let Ms. Top talk about this. She's way more of an authority than I am. But there is a distinction between licensed day home providers and unlicensed through the province. Yeah.
I'll wait to hear from that person. I see they're on the list to speak. Awesome. Last question, how much staff time would you guess was used last year in 2019 on those 229 development permit applications?
So just a clarification, the 229 was that's how many we've had in total here within the community, right? It wasn't just last year, because that'd be a lot.
I was going to say, that's a lot of day homes.
Yeah. It's a lot of time.
How many would you have in 2019, roughly?
That's a good question. Just give me a second.
All right. Okay. I don't need an exact number. I was just thinking roughly, what's the effect on staff for streamlining?
So the effect on staff without having to process these permits would be a significant saving on staff time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Perdeco, you have another question.
Actually, not another question, but a comment. As being a member of CPC, the one thing that we did discover was that 6 children did not necessarily mean 6 children in total. So I could technically have 6 children, but then have another 6 children be a part of my care, right? So I just want to make sure that that is clear upon council, that it's not 6 children per day. You can have your biological family and be caring for them, but 6 additional kids. Is that correct, Mr. Welden?
In the addition of the day home, I don't believe we distinguish between the children being cared for within the home and the children that are coming to the daycare, or to the day home, excuse me.
Really? I thought that we had talked about that, because that was a question that was in concern versus, you know, what does 6 children mean? If I had 4 children, does that mean I can only have 2 additional children in my care? But from what I understood, that your children, your own biological children, were not part of that package. You could have 6 additional children come.
Right, and I believe that that is the distinction between the provincial regulations as well, right? So again, I'm sure Ms. Top will touch on that as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Reid, another question?
Yeah, just quickly, I looked up the Child Care Licensing Act, and it says under Section 25(1) that B, that no more than 6 children, and it defines it as 6 children in a private residence, referring to Clause A, under family daycare program. So that kind of coincides with what you're saying, just as a reference.
Right, okay, thank you.
Okay. No other questions? Thank you, and this is, you said, staff-led, so no applicant. We'll go to the list in the gallery. Thank you, Mr. Welden.
Thank you.
I have one speaker, Ms. Top. Did I say that right? Top? Top?
Top.
Top?
Yes.
Thank you.
Not bottom, top.
I will never forget that.
Sorry,
Good
I'm
evening.
just gonna-
Thanks for joining us and having your voice heard. I see you're navigating our system.
All right, we got it. Good evening, and I wanted to thank members of council for giving us an opportunity to speak. I'm Maureen Top. I'm the manager of licensed programs for Playdays Family Day Home Agency, as well as the Boys and Girls Club. So Playdays is actually one of our programs. And tonight I just wanted to present our perspective on the proposed land use bylaw amendment, and just give you a quick overview in terms of what we do and our role as a day home agency. So we do work in affiliation with Provincial Child Services Authority and are contracted by them. So our day homes are considered licensed and accredited, which are 2 different government bodies, one related to sort of basic standards, the provincial regulation, and the other accreditation is more along the lines of our programming and the quality of our programming. And so our role is to ensure compliance to provincial regulation and standards. We also provide a number of additional services for regulated. So if you hear regulated, licensed, I'm not talking about business license, I'm talking about government licensed. Day homes, we do provide them with liability insurance. We have a fairly lengthy and thorough screening process. Families who are attending our day homes do have access to subsidized childcare, so if they do qualify financially, they can access that since we are a licensed program. Our family day home consultants, a few of which are here tonight, they provide regular monitoring visits, so monthly visits to our family day homes. We do biannual full safety checks of our day homes. We offer regular professional development to our family day homes. We do have programming standards in alignment with accreditation, supervision and ratio standards, incident reporting and investigation, as well as complaint investigation processes in alignment with the government. We have health and safety standards, and all of our family day homes maintain child records. From the perspective of community need, what we see as a day home agency, there is no secret Cochrane is a growing community. I mean, we see that in the development that's happening. Very vibrant, and parents really do often want the option of home-based childcare. Not to knock childcare centers, it's really a personal preference, and we want to be able to help families meet that need. Presently, our agency is only meeting 10% of our requests for childcare under the age of 24 months. And that's really disheartening for us. 25% of our families with children under the age of 3, so between that 24-month mark and age 3, are able to find day homes when they contact us looking for referrals, and 40% approximately over the age of 3. So that gives you a really good sense of how full our day homes are presently. And in terms of the economic perspective, operating a day home provides an opportunity for women in our community to secure an income while also meeting a community need. And often some of those women have had challenges accessing childcare. We've actually seen a number of full circle, parents coming to us looking for family day homes and then working with us to open their own family day home, which is really nice to be able to facilitate. So when we consider related community data, women do tend to be economically at a disadvantage in Cochrane and surrounding areas just due to the lack of access of affordable childcare. As a mom of 4 myself, as soon as I had more than 2 children, it just didn't even make sense for me to continue teaching. I would be putting my entire paycheck towards childcare. So I decided to open a family day home and be able to do both. When we consider the need to balance that privatized as well as nonprofit childcare within our community, that's also extremely important to support. There is a lack of affordable childcare that was communicated in the Cochrane Community Cares Survey needs assessment. And so we don't want to continue to have barriers for families to access childcare when they're already saying that that's a challenge for them. So in terms of our comments related to the proposed amendment to the land use bylaw related to day homes, it really would reduce the time frame that's needed to open a day home. If all goes well and one of our providers applies for their development permit, it takes approximately 8 weeks. And then we have our own screening process, but typically we're done that process with our family day home operators and they're still waiting for their development permits. It still does allow for public feedback. So if someone has a concern about parking or noise at a day home, there's still the opportunity to respond from an enforcement perspective. For example, if parking was a concern at a family day home. There's definitely going to be a reduced impact in terms of community resources, so agency resources, town resources, and even from the circulation process, those applications being put out to local organizations. And essentially, it would take a supportive stance on self-employed women in our community that are providing a key community service. It also places Cochrane in alignment with the majority of towns and cities across Alberta, which Mr. Welden pointed out in his presentation. And the proposed bylaw also does fall within alignment with the provincial standards that do require family day home operators to have 6 children including their own within day homes, and if you're unlicensed, you can have still the 6 children as well as your own children. And there is options for enforcement with the provincial body too. So if somebody did have a concern about a family day home and the number of children attending, licensing officers will come out and visit the day home, even if it is not a licensed family day home. And they can order cease and desist. They do try to work to have compliance so that that service can continue to be provided, but they can close a day home. So some of the recent examples that we have seen as an agency, whereas there was either an appeal or a barrier to attaining the development permit, were related to parking and traffic flow. Big surprise. So one of our appeals, actually, we had 2 appeals that were related specifically to somebody not wanting to listen to children playing, and the delay that causes in that already long process to apply for a development permit is quite long. So we're looking at that 8-week process. If somebody is applying for a variance because there's some technicality that their property doesn't meet, then we're waiting to go and appear before Cochrane Planning Commission, and I believe there's about a 14-day decision time frame. And then if there's an appeal, again, we're waiting to get on the agenda to appear before the appeal board, and then there's also a decision-making time frame there. And so I hope everyone has a sense of humor, but this is me typically waiting for the development permits to come through. So one example was Claire Dowd. Some of you may have noticed this one in the media. She was a day home provider who was already open and operating as a licensed accredited day home up in Glen Eagles. She did move to another family-oriented neighborhood, a property that had a triple driveway, a triple garage, a basement suite that was intended for day home use. The neighborhood is made up of single-family homes, lots of young families. There was no home-based business restrictions, and her day home was held up for, in addition to the development permit application, all total was about 3 months, maybe a little bit more, 3.5 months by the time the appeal board made the decision and she was permitted to go ahead and open her day home. But the impact on the families who were registered with her was quite significant. We did have to try to find placement, and we did have one family with 2 siblings who ended up moving on to another childcare facility because she couldn't just wait and hope that the day home would open. And we also didn't have enough day homes to accommodate all of her children. So we had some pretty frustrated and disappointed families, and the impact to Claire's income was very significant over a 3-month period as well. Megan Corns also had her day home appealed. Same concerns. Neighbors decided to file an appeal, noting concerns that there may be potential issues with parking, traffic flow, and the noise of children from the day home. Megan also met the development permit requirements. She had a double driveway, a double garage. She did also have a basement suite that was intended to be day home use. The neighborhood, again, is made up of single-family homes, a lot of young families, and her permit was held up for an extra 4 weeks approximately in addition to the development permit. The appeals tend to be submitted the last day that they can be, from what I've learned from this process. So that did delay her day home opening, and then her families who were waiting to access care, because that was a brand new day home. So that really had a significant impact on families that were waiting to access childcare, one of which had to delay their return to work. Sarah White, who's actually here this evening, had the lengthiest delay of just over 5 months to open her day home, which was a significant impact to her planned income. This one was related to a variance. So on a technicality, her driveway did not fit 2 vehicles. So in order to meet the residential requirement to have 2 parking stalls on the property, from the picture, I think it's pretty clear that she did have 2 parking stalls. That's a full-size Suburban as well as a GM pickup truck in her driveway. And so we did just go through that process with her, and she was able to open her day home and has been operating ever since. There was also some concerns brought up at that point about safety, and none of those issues really had to do with what is outlined in the bylaw. So it really was a drain on resources for our day home agency. A lot of our families just ended up moving on and finding other childcare, and Sarah was in a really challenging position. So again, she had the tandem double driveway. There was just a portion of her driveway that wasn't counted in the application due to the sidewalk requirement. To speak to the element of noise, that some people might be concerned of. So if a neighbor was like, oh, I'm really concerned about the noise that 6 children may cause next door. Again, I'm a parent of 4, and my kids pretty much always have somebody over at my house, and I've never ever had a neighbor call and be upset with me about the noise of children playing. Although I do understand and respect that, it really shouldn't be a reason that somebody can't open and operate a day home, because nobody can tell you can't have 6 kids in your home at any given time. The noise of children playing is fairly typical of the neighborhoods that these day homes are operating in, especially in our regulated family day homes, so I'm quite partial to that, but they do tend to be very organized. They're supervised. There's not a lot of chaos and screaming, and I can only speak to the regulated element of family day homes. We've never received a noise complaint in 12 years about a family day home. And so the land use bylaw amendment really does make sense. And as a side note, like being easily distracted or upset by children is more of a personal issue, which is why those appeals tended to be overturned. So for our family day homes, we've actually had a total of 11 regulated family day homes in the past 3.5 years who've experienced delays to opening their day homes related to the development permit process, which is quite significant. And just as a side note, so prior to that, prior to my work with the day home agency, I initially started as a program coordinator. I did speak with the other program coordinator, and our now executive director was also the program coordinator prior to that, and they actually didn't have any day homes that had any hang-ups opening. And so we were really trying to examine like what was that change. And in 2016, there was an addition for a parking requirement to the land use bylaw, whereas previously day homes did not require any kind of parking. And there was a little bit of confusion with the enforcement. So we had some day home providers applying and being told they needed a third parking stall. And there was a little bit of hang up there. So that's why some of ours were delayed. We did actually have 3 day homes that did not open as a result of the development permit process being challenged and experiencing barriers. 2 of which, one in Glenbow and one in Fireside, were actually early childhood educators who had post-secondary degrees. So that was really disappointing for us. We certainly would have supported them through the process, but at the time, they didn't want to go and apply for variances and hope that things worked out, and they moved on to other employment and then found childcare through us. We did have, all of those did require agency involvement and town resources. Some of them as simple as some meetings just to work through some of the technicalities. Other were more complicated, and we did have to go through appeal processes. And then those delays in each case were related to parking and neighbor input. So when it comes to parking, and I do know that this is a primary concern, and I understand that as a resident of Cochrane. I have the luxury of living in Riverview, so we don't have as many issues, but the residential requirement itself meets the current land use bylaw of having 2 parking stalls on the property. And so our day home providers, and I'm sure that most unlicensed day homes already work through that with their families. Where they're going to drop off their kids and where they're going to pick up their kids is just a part of running a day home. And those are pretty simple conversations to navigate with your families. And that's where really engaging with your neighbors is just the right thing to do when you're going to open a family day home. From an agency perspective, typically, if we have multiple children attending a day home, they're often sibling groups. In probably half of our day homes, we have sibling groups attending. So although we might have 6 children attending a family day home, if that provider does not have children, the number of vehicles or visits to the home are usually not anywhere near that 6. And given that most of our family day home providers have children of their own, sometimes they're only taking in 2 children, 3 children at a time. And if some of them are siblings, that's really not a lot of vehicle traffic coming to the home, which is why we don't get a lot of complaints about parking, or any. I've never received a parking complaint since I took on this role. Some families are within walking distance of some of their day homes. A lot of people do look for day homes in the area that they live. It's more convenient for them. There is the ability to stagger and schedule those drop-offs if that is a concern for that particular day home. For the ones that we work with, that would be part of our conversation when we're doing the screening with that family day home. As I said, in 12 years, our agency has actually never received a parking complaint. I can't speak to the town's complaint intake process, but we do really encourage having a safe parking plan for our day home providers. And our perspective is that typical drop-off and pickup is not very different than most residential neighborhoods would see. I mean, you have people selling things on garage sale, you have people ordering skip the dishes, you got school buses coming in and out, realtors showing houses that are for sale. So, you know, a couple vehicles coming, walking to the house, dropping off their children and leaving. They're not staying there. There's a very temporary nature of their parking. Most families just want to get their kids and go home, or drop their kids off and just get out of there. And I think most of our day home providers can speak to that. We really want to keep those transitions very, very short. The impact when day homes are delayed through this process, our families are typically sitting there with an indefinite plan. And so our family day home providers sometimes lose those placements, and our families are sometimes making decisions for their childcare that they may not have made if that day home was not delayed. We did have some siblings who were separated in some of those instances because we couldn't place them in one day home. Parents' employment can be disrupted. We had one family who was waiting for so long for a placement, and then when she found one, the day home was delayed. And it really had an impact on them in terms of just even their emotional impact from that. In terms of financial, when our family day home operators are planning to open their business, they necessarily don't plan for a 3-month delay in opening their day homes. So that can really pose a significant barrier for them. And just our wait lists alone, if day homes are delayed opening, it's such a huge barrier just to access childcare. It is a huge issue in our community. And the other thing that we have noticed, we've had several day home providers move. So they're open and operating in one neighborhood, and then they move to another neighborhood. Maybe they find a house that's more conducive to operating their day home, their family is growing and they want to move. They have to go through that whole process all over again, and they have to plan that whole transition, not knowing if someone's going to appeal their day home. And that's really unsettling for our day home providers when they're trying to transition their business. We almost have to tell them to plan that they may be out of income for a small period of time, just to have that in the back of their mind, which is not pleasant for them. So similar to Mr. Welden, we did touch base with some different agencies across Alberta as well as municipalities. And from what we could find, I actually have all of the emails that we did receive from other agencies, and we're also part of, so Playdays is part of the Alberta Family Childcare Association, so I attend regular meetings and we do a lot of networking at those, and so I've been able to touch base with other directors and ask those questions about whether development permits are required. And across the board, the majority of communities do not require a development permit for their family day homes. Some of those communities only require a development permit for unregulated childcare. So they do require a permit for those day homes, but if they're regulated through a day home agency and they're government licensed, then they do not require the development permit. So that's the other thing that we've seen. So Lethbridge, Red Deer, Medicine Hat, Grand Prairie, Camrose, Chestermere, Okotoks, Calgary, Edmonton, Fort McMurray, Hannah, Brooks, Stettler, Red Deer, Edmonton, Redcliffe, Tabor, Tofield. And when I say Edmonton, it's the whole Edmonton area, St. Albert, Sherwood Park. They don't require development permits. So it did tell us that we were on the right track with our sense that there was something kind of challenging that we needed to really evaluate. Is this something that maybe is potential for change? And just a note to Canmore was the most restrictive, Mr. Welden mentioned. I have spoken with the director from DeVar, and they have actually been working with the local FCSS and attending council meetings, pushing for a very similar change in that community too, because they're experiencing similar barriers. So just a side note on that one. So thank you for your consideration. I think it's a lot more than just the cost of a development permit. That's the challenge here. So yeah, thank you. Any
So if
questions?
I could summarize,
I'm sorry.
you're in favor.
I am in favor. Sorry, I should have said that from the get-go.
I'm just teasing you. Thank you for your presentation. Very in-depth. You're obviously very passionate about what you do. It shows. Thank you for being out here tonight. Councillor Federico, you have a question?
I only have one question. My own child has been in the Playdate agency, so I'm thankful for all the work that you guys do, and you guys provide supreme care for our kids, and it's definitely thanked on our side. When it comes to the question of 2 workers, you know, if you are a mom of 4 and then you're having an additional, say, 6 more children, perhaps, or whatever that looks like, what are your thoughts of having an additional worker come into your home, and that perhaps maybe restriction of not having that extra help? Because that was a question that came up from CPC, was that if you have that number of children, perhaps an extra helping hand in one-person parking is not a big deal. In my concern, I would rather have my child looked after than versus a restrictive parking space.
Through the mayor to Councillor Federico, actually right now there are provincial regulations that do speak to that. So in a home where they wanted to have an additional employee and then therefore more kids and increase that ratio, they are required to apply for group family licensed childcare. So they would then go through that permit process through the town, and then they can actually go directly through childcare licensing. So it is an option and an opportunity for those family day homes. Family day homes, not group family day homes, there's 2 different bodies there, but are restricted to 1 person in the home. So as an agency, though, as a side note on what we do, we're not considered employees. We actually contract with our family day homes. But because we go through the same process and screening process for our jobs, we do actually offer intervention services within our family day homes through a local kindergarten that may or may not have been mentioned earlier. And so we offer speech therapy, occupational therapy within our day homes. So we do have those visiting usually on a bi-weekly basis, again on a temporary nature, about an hour. So there is that parking, and we do relieve them for their IPP meetings. However, that's where the day home provider is leaving, and we're coming in, and parents have given permission, but we're not an employee of the home, so.
So when it comes to that group family childcare, where does that fit in versus, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Welden, like where does that fit in with this overall arching thing that there's can only be one provider? Is it completely different? Is that a separate
My understanding is
licensing?
that they would fall under childcare services.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect, thank you. So it goes into the next level
Yeah.
then? Excellent, thank you very much.
Okay, Councillor Flowers.
Thank you. You did a good job of outlining some of the barriers and problems that we've seen in the last few years. I'm stuck on the 6 kids per day or 6 kids at a time. As people are developing their business and some want part-time and just maybe before and after school care, would it not be very difficult to say only 6 kids total per day?
Through the mayor to Councillor Flowers, we actually, the provincial regulation is 6 children at any given time in the care of that day home provider. So if there were children walking home after school and some other children had gone home, they would still be able to offer that care. It's not necessarily a per day, it's at any given time. And as a day home agency, though, we then evaluate the parking impact for the community. We want there to be a positive image of family day homes in the community, but children walking home from school and other children have already gone home, they would certainly still be allowed to do that.
So there could be 8 or 9 kids total, but not all at the same time.
Right.
It's only 6 at a time.
Right, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Top, for all the work yourself and the Boys and Girls Club do on this. It's really important community service. We all appreciate it. Your one part in the slides that struck me was you said you were unable to meet the majority of the needs of residents, and the percentages you put were pretty stark. 90% of the certain age group wasn't even looked after right now. Does it go without saying that our regulations are what you think are gumming up the system and why those percentages aren't much more respectable? Or is there some other thing that I'm missing too? Please.
Through the mayor to Councillor Wilson, there would be other reasons for that. We're always trying to encourage more family day homes to open. We actually are only contracted to oversee 45 day homes in the Cochrane area. So as soon as we have a wait list of day home providers waiting to open, then we need to apply to the government for more funding. And right now, the climate isn't positive for that. But we have had some day home providers not open due to some of the restrictions, yes. It would not be the primary reason we're not meeting the need.
But these steps we're taking would be a step in the right direction.
Absolutely, it would certainly make accessing those day homes much faster through that opening process, and really encourage the operation of those day homes.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. If anyone needs copies of agency emails about their permits, I shall leave them here.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else in the gallery that wishes to speak for or against?
I just have a question. I don't know how this works.
If you have to come up to the microphone and state your name, please.
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry.
Very formal. Yeah.
My coat and my boots. I'm Alexandra Antonozzi. I actually currently work for a nonprofit agency in the early childhood education field, and I've been in the field 25 years myself. But I was actually just going to ask Ms. Top if she could just clarify the number of children in the home, because my understanding, and maybe Maureen, you could correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding from the regulations is it's 6 children at any one time, including your own children under the age of 13. So for instance, right, I just wanted to clarify that because for myself and anybody else that might be wondering, there seem to be a lot of questions about the 6 children. So nobody could typically have 10 children under the age of 13, is that correct?
Under regulated.
Right, regulated childcare at home, correct? Yeah. Yeah. That's my question.
For an unregulated family day home, if you have more than 10 children, you are in non-compliance with the government. So you couldn't have 6 children and take care of 6 children. And that's where it's actually reportable, and licensing officers will come in and check the home and go from there. Does that make sense? So 6 including your own under the age of 13 if you are regulated. If you are unregulated and just operating your own home-based day home, you can have 6 in addition to your own, but no more than 10.
Okay, Councillor Reid, you have a question?
Yeah, so I have a question on that then. So if I understand you correctly, so I'm just reading the Child Care Licensing Act, which says under Family Day Home Program, Section 25(1), subsection B, that no more than 6 children in each private residence. So you're saying that this is a regulated, these people are regulated under the Act, or I'm not sure I understand.
The agency that I work for are government regulated, so their 6 children include their own. So if you already have 2 children, you can only take 4 more children into your care.
So that's different than what the Act actually says then?
There's a subset of standards for family day homes. It's called the Alberta Family Day Home Standards.
This is family day homes?
Under the Child Licensing Act?
Yes.
Yes. So you can have, under the Child Licensing Act, if you took more than 6 children into your care, you have to be licensed directly through the government as group family care, and you need another caregiver in the home.
Yeah, I guess I'd have to see that in writing to understand it, because this
Okay.
is certainly different than what you're saying, and this is a published act, right? So, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Is there anyone else that wishes to speak? Favor? Opposed to the changes? No? Councillor, any other questions of administration? No? Okay, we will close this public hearing. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. We'll move on to public hearing for Bylaw 3, 2020, amendment to accessory suites and garden suites. Mr. Welden, you've got full slate tonight.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there water? Just seeing if there's any water.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah. And there is. Excellent. Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Okay. I think the concerns in the gallery have left.
I think so. I hope so.
That's a pun on the past. We used to call them gallery concerns, so anyways, it was lost. Carry on.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to present Bylaw 03-2020, which is a land use bylaw amendment related to accessory suites and garden suites for public hearing tonight. Similar to Bylaw 02, this is an administratively led textual amendment to our land use bylaw. It was identified as a priority outside of the land use bylaw review project. And the proposed amendment, like for the day homes, is town-wide and will affect all the communities within the town of Cochrane. The purpose of the amendment is to update the regulations for accessory suites and garden suites, address potential for clustering, and streamline the process. So generally, there was a sense that the regulations needed to be updated. There was an overall concern about clustering within the neighborhoods for accessory suites, and there was also a concern about the time required to process the applications and the significant time and effort for each of the applications from administration. Accessory suites and garden suite regulations have not been changed since 2005, which is one of the reasons why they were identified as a priority to come forward before the Land Use Bylaw Review Project is complete. And as of January 1st, 2020, 175 have been applied for, that's accessory suites, and 163 development permits have been issued. 131 of those since 2008, so they have been increasing in popularity since 2008. Just for clarity, accessory suites are located within the principal dwelling itself, while garden suites are separated from the principal dwelling and are located in the rear yard of the property. And I'll get into the definitions here in a few minutes. What are we proposing? So firstly, we are proposing 3 new definitions in the land use bylaw and to revise 2 existing definitions for clarity and to support the regulations that are being proposed. Firstly is block face. We are defining block face, and this is a new definition, to mean adjoining lots on one side of the street, not separated by private streets and or public lands such as arterial streets, collector streets, local streets, lanes, pathways greater than 6 meters in width, parks, and similar lands. And this is added so that we are able to regulate accessory suites and garden suites at this smaller scale within the neighborhood. So just to get, you can see the diagram here, but essentially we have the streets here in the darker color, and so this would be one block face here. You have the separation for the lane here, so that would separate it from this block face. And then this block face obviously is separated amongst the other block faces as well. Another new definition for our bylaw is for a studio suite. It is not currently defined. I think everyone would or knows what a studio suite is, but we will define it to help us regulate it as well. It is a dwelling unit where cooking, living, and sleeping areas are combined into a single space. They were previously also called bachelor suites, but we do not use that term anymore. They are studio suites. And again, to allow for regulations for this type of use and to provide some clarity about this dwelling type for an accessory suite or a garden suite. Tandem parking was not previously defined in our bylaw as well, and this means 2 parking spaces, one behind the other with a common or shared point of access to the maneuvering aisle, street, or lane. And this is to provide clarity to the extent of this parking configuration and provides clarity when analyzing future applications when this tandem parking is to be applied for the suites. We are revising 2 current definitions, and they are for the accessory suite itself and as well as for the garden suite. So the accessory suite is defined now as a self-contained dwelling unit which is accessory to the principal dwelling and is located within a single detached dwelling or a semi-detached dwelling on a residential lot. This will help clarify where an accessory suite can be located as definitions cannot be varied. So what we mean by this is that we have purposely defined or limited accessory suites themselves. So you can see these are the ones that would ultimately be a basement suite, to be limited to single detached dwellings and semi-detached dwellings. And so if you had a street-oriented townhome, for example, you would not be able to have a suite located in it because it wouldn't meet this definition. And just for clarity, it can't be varied because uses, as defined, cannot be varied in any way. Regulations can, but uses cannot. Garden suite, as well, is a self-contained dwelling unit which is accessory to the principal dwelling and is located in the rear yard of a residential lot upon which an existing single detached dwelling is located. So single detached dwelling only. The garden suite must be detached from the principal dwelling and can be a separate standalone building on the property or attached to or above an accessory building, in most cases usually a garage. Again, this will help clarify where garden suites can be located as definitions cannot be varied, similar as before, and proposing that they are only allowed on a lot with a single detached dwelling. So lots with semi-detached dwellings would not be able to have a garden suite in the rear yard. Number 2, the maximum of 2 tandem parking stalls on a property, unless the property is 9 meters wide or less, then only 1 tandem parking stall is allowed. So you're allowed 2 tandem parking stalls on a lot if it's 9 meters or wider, and only 1 tandem if it is less than 9 meters. So this clarifies that it can be considered in certain cases, ensures yard amenity space, ensures the property isn't overdeveloped, and could limit the number of bedrooms allowed. So normally the number of stalls is linked directly to the number of bedrooms for the suite. Parking within the special parking zone for 2 or more bedrooms be reduced from 1.75 stalls to 1 stall. Now, we spoke about this at first reading, but this specific area, which is on the screen now, is meant to promote development, and that's why it's there's been a reduction in the parking within this area. So to keep in that theme, we are proposing that a suite that is proposed in this area that has 2 or more bedrooms, that only 1 parking stall be required. And also the reason is you can't actually develop 1.75 of a stall. It's either a whole stall, 1 or 2, and so on. Number 4, requiring a safe unimpeded access, and this is from the parking area to the suite itself. This has been a very long-standing condition to our development permits for many years. However, it is not a formal regulation within our land use bylaw. We do see the merit in this, in formalizing it through this amendment, and that's why it's being brought forward. Increased setback from garden suite to the principal dwelling, the house itself, from 1.83 meters, which is 6 feet, to 2.8 meters, which is 8 feet. This is to align with the setback distance between 2 principal dwellings, and ultimately to ensure a larger amenity space within the rear yard. Now, number 6 is the replacement of the 10% limit per neighborhood with criteria that must be considered by the Development Authority. Now, just to explain, currently we have a 10% limit, maximum limit for accessory suites within the neighborhood. So what that means is only 10% of all of the lots within the neighborhood can be developed with an accessory suite. And so we are proposing to eliminate that 10% limit, but replace it with criteria that must be considered when you're considering a development permit for an accessory suite or garden suite. This is the adherence to the land use district purpose and intent. This is adherence to the regulation for the parcel and for the use, and also being mindful of the cumulative impacts from clustering of accessory residential uses. So not just the accessory suites themselves, but all of the accessory residential uses that may be on that block face, as we defined earlier. These include home-based businesses, suites, and bed and breakfasts. And some of these cumulative impacts can be the capacity of utility services, the traffic generation relative to the capacity of the existing road network, and parking congestion within that area. So a little bit of the explanation. So first, let's start with the 10% limit. This isn't based on a tangible impact-based rationale. So this 10% limit, when we did some research into where this 10% limit came from or was applied, we couldn't find any, and that was established in 1999, and we're not sure why here at the town. And it's also difficult to rationalize the limit when addressing impacts resulting from the potential suite at that scale, so at the neighborhood scale. So thinking like a community like Sunset with 16 to 1,700 lots, and having the 10% applied to that, and not bringing it down to the block consideration, it means a lot of accessory suites can be considered at that scale. The application of the 10% limit at the neighborhood scale, I just mentioned, but specifically until this limit is reached, the number of suites in the neighborhood cannot be used as a reason for refusal. So until that threshold is met, that regulation is met. So it really, I guess in the short term, really does not do anything to help us regulate the suites within those areas. Most neighborhoods are between 0% and 3.5, with only one of our communities at 6% currently. I just wanted to present a bit of a clustering example, and this is an example that we used or that has been more of a recent example in the past couple of years that, made us really take a look at our accessory suite regulations. And so this is up in Sunset Ridge. As mentioned, we have almost 1,800 eligible lots currently. There's 35 suites approved, so that is 1.9% total, when looking at that 10% limit. And we can have up to 180 suites within this area. So again, that criteria is met. As soon as you look at the number of suites, yeah, we're nowhere near the 10%. But it doesn't avoid the clustering, which is an issue that we have come upon, and specifically this example in Sunset Ridge. So applying the block face, the new definition of block face, this is one block face here. We have 11 suites within this block face of 24 lots. So ultimately, we are just shy of 50% of the lots within this block face having accessory suites. So you start to get that clustering effect. And so now you're looking at, okay, well, what are the impacts of that clustering effect on this, not only on this block face, but on the surrounding community as well. Now, using our criteria that we have established, and this is the cumulative impacts of the accessory residential uses that we are proposing here tonight, we are looking at another area of town, and this is in Heritage Hills. So we have Heritage Landing. We have 3 existing, the approved suites are in purple. When you add in some of the other accessory residential uses, we have the day homes, which are listed in the hatching here. We have home-based business majors, which, forgive me with my color blindness, but I believe is here. I don't know if there's another example. And then we have a home-based business minor, which is really just that office, so it doesn't have much of an impact, but we're mindful of where those home-based business minors are as well, which are located here. So by applying this new criteria, we are broadening our analysis of the accessory residential uses and the cumulative impacts that could result not only from the accessory suite or the clustering of the suites, but all the other accessory residential uses within the community. So again, consideration of the cumulative impacts. The 10% limit does not provide any clarity as to whether the suite is appropriate at a specific location, especially at that block face level. And to determine the suitability, you must consider the adherence to the existing regulations. I would also add in the purpose and intent of the district, the physical and environmental conditions, the impact to the surrounding community, and the analysis of the cumulative impacts of the surrounding uses, as I mentioned earlier. Now, lastly, is number 7, the development officer to become the development authority. The Cochrane Planning Commission will remain for variances over 10%. So this has been proposed for the following reasons. This is to reduce timelines for permitting and the decision process. So if the Cochrane Planning Commission is the development authority, it is a minimum of 6 to 10 weeks until a decision is rendered, and that is given the frequency of the meetings, once per month. However, if it is administration in the development officer or with the development officer, it is a minimum of about 4 weeks until the decision is rendered. Also, this reduces staff time needed for applications. There's an average of 18 applications per year. 17 went to CPC in 2019. One meeting had 5 suite applications. Each application requires a report to be written, have it reviewed by the manager, a presentation specifically for each application, and then the attendance and presentation at the Cochrane Planning Commission in the evening, which does result in overtime for staff as well. All other regulations for suites, for these garden suites and the accessory suites remain the same. This includes the districts where the suites are an allowable use. They will remain as a discretionary use. They are not proposed to be permitted. They will still be a discretionary use. The parking requirement outside of the special parking zone remains the same. The minimum size at 30 square meters in area, the maximum gross floor area of 40% of the principal dwelling remains the same. And for the garden suites only, which is in the rear yard, the height, side yard setbacks, and rear yard setbacks remain the same as well. It does align with the Cochrane community vision, aligns with the livability theme, as well as supporting diverse housing options for the town. The Cochrane Sustainability Plan and Pathway 9 and Pathway 11, with everyone has a roof over their heads, and wherever you are in Cochrane, you are close and connected. It does adhere to our municipal development plan, diversity of housing, which is a community goal to ensure housing is available to everyone. And the planning principle 1, which is responsible growth management, use limited land base efficiently, and the growth management strategy that operates on the premise that 25% of new growth will occur through redevelopment or infill, and this is certainly one of the options. Communication and public engagement. Prior to drafting the bylaw, 2 public information sessions, one in the spring of 2018 and 1 workshop also in the spring of 2018 occurred. We did have a survey May and June in 2018 with 78 responses. Once the draft was created, second survey in March and April of last year with 56 responses. It was presented to the Developer Liaison Group and the Realtor Forum in March and April of last year. And a summary of survey responses was included in your report, and all comments were considered when finalizing the proposed bylaw. This was proposed to the Cochrane Planning Commission on January 15th with the following comments supplied to Council. They see this as a positive stride in closing the loop by improving past CPC concerns, updating information on defining a suite such as cooking, sleeping, and living, but there is a way to stipulate fridge, stove versus hot plate or microwave to limit the gray area, and that term is in terms of how a dwelling unit is defined. There was discussion around numbers or the need for numbers in addition to the clustering of regulations. Right now, there is no specific number like a 10% or X amount per block face. And discussion about whether or not suites should be approved by a singular person or the DO or a larger body, such as the Cochrane Planning Commission, and could lead to more appeals or frustration with suites essentially town approved or denied, town approved meaning by administration. And there was a discussion about whether CPC should report or should support the proposed policy. While CPC understands the time saving for administration as a majority, they are not in favor of CPC being removed as the development authority. There was discussion surrounding whether or not accessory suites should still come forward to the CPC for now and then transition to administration. And lastly, ways to find better efficiencies when administration presents to CPC if that is the direction of Council. The recommendation tonight is that Council receives and considers all comments presented during the public hearing for Bylaw 3 2020, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Okay, thank you. In-depth report. Councillor Padeco, do you have a question?
I wanted to thank Mr. Welden and the planning and the whole planning team, because you guys have done a ton of work on this and trying to make it, I think, more streamlined, less time for CPC, and whatever that looks like is whatever council decides. But the question does come back to, how do we actually know, if I'm a person shopping on rentfaster.ca and there is a suite being advertised, whether or not it's an actual regulated suite or it's not a regulated suite. And I know that we had talked about that at CPC versus, people advertising a suite that is an actual separate edition versus, hey, I have a suite in my basement and it has, a hot plate and it's got something, but it actually isn't even necessarily licensed. So, I mean, how do you separate those two versus the gray versus, the actual approved ones?
Through the mayor to Councillor Padeco, there is an inherent gray area with these. We, through our definitions, we we define accessory suites and garden suites, as standalone dwelling units. So that means they have to be a standalone dwelling unit, and we define a dwelling unit in a specific way, and it has to, as mentioned earlier, it has to have those cooking facilities. It has to have, you know, a bathroom, a cooking facility, and a separate living quarters. Now, people have found different ways to go around those, and my suggestion to those people, when there is a suite that is advertised that may not be legal, to contact the town and to do their due diligence. We do keep track of all of the suites that have been approved through the town, so it's a bit of buyer beware in that circumstance. So,
Perfect, that's fabulous. I think that's information that needs to go back out to the public, that, you know, if you are looking to rent, and if you are going to be living in a combination that you think is actually licensed or regulated, that it may not actually be that way, and so that people need to double check or to look into those, whether or not they're actually permitted or not, because I think that's great advice, because honestly, as somebody who has actually looked at them, there is no variance in price. It's not like one is cheaper necessarily than the other. People get away with it because they can, so I think that's great advice.
okay.
Councillor McFadden?
Thank you, and yes, a great presentation, and I know a lot of work's gone into it, and it got more complicated as Cochrane got bigger. I really appreciate the approach to look at the cumulative impacts of what's going on in the neighborhood and the impact on both the initial design of the residents and those that are living there. So my question though is how, like with your cumulative impacts, you could look at it and understand you've got your home-based major businesses, basement suites, day homes, it's all in the block. And so you get an application and you're like, you know what, cumulatively, we're evaluating that this is just not a fit. There's too much here. But is there any way we're tracking when those uses are going away? Because if somebody's given up on their home-based business major or they've closed their day home, like those numbers might not be accurate anymore. Mm-hmm. Is there any way of tracking that, or are you just, once you've applied, you're kind of on the map?
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor McFadden, that is a good question. It's one thing to keep in mind when we approve development permits is that the approval goes with the land. It doesn't go with the actual applicant. So even though, let's say I own a property and I develop it with a suite within the town, and I get the approval and I make it comply with all the building and safety codes and everything is above board, if I move, that approval remains in place. So that suite can continue on that property in perpetuity with those approvals. So even though it may not operate, so the next person who I sell to decides not to operate the suite, for a time being, they could then sell it, and if someone wants to operate the suite, then they can operate the suite. So it really ensures that we're considering that throughout, in perpetuity throughout time. So, and that's regardless of whether it's actually being operated or not because of that. So if we're making a judgment call on adding another suite within that area, we have to be mindful because that suite, even though it's not operating now, could operate in 5 years or through another landowner, right? Okay. So
I can certainly understand that from a basement suite because the property itself has been physically changed to allow for that. But when you're looking at like a home-based major, if somebody's got that and they've closed their business, do they ever tell you that they've closed their business so that you know that that's then available on that cumulative math piece, or also the day homes? Mm-hmm. Like, do you know when that's no longer operating so you can subtract that from your cumulative additions? Right,
and similar to the accessory suite example, that does apply for home-based business majors as well. So even though a home-based business major was applied for a specific type of business, that the approval of the home-based business major is regardless of the the type of business that's being operated. So again, if I was to get the home-based business major, operate a specific, like let's say a hair cutting business out of my home, and then I move, that home-based business major is permit is still valid for that property. So someone else could come in and do something completely different in terms of a business. As long as they're adhering to the regulations and the conditions of their permit, they can then operate their home-based business, a different type of home-based business. So again, we would need to be mindful of it in perpetuity and the potential for that impact to also be applied if another suite was to happen. Now, day homes, we spoke about day homes, and that's a good one where we're basically saying a day home is acceptable as a permitted use. The only way that we would be tracking them now would be through our business license. And so that is a consideration for tracking in the future for day homes and taking that into the analysis of whether another accessory suite is appropriate for that particular community. So we would be tracking that through the business license, and if they do move and that day home is no longer operating there, then we would need to be mindful of that, of course. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Councillor Wilson.
3 quick questions if I could. I think they'll be quick. Being careful not to offer any opinion as this is a public hearing, so it's got to be questions. Piggybacking on that one, on the block face for the heritage example, was that, because I still don't understand the block face part of it, would it be allowed to have, would there be another accessory suite allowed in that block face, or have we reached maximum on that example? Or would that be a decision made by the Development Authority or CPC? I didn't understand in this example.
Right. So in this example, this was provided just to show the difference between just looking at the accessory suites as opposed to all the accessory residential uses, such as the ones that are listed here. So as you can see, this would be a block face. This would basically be one block face, and this is another block face, and this is another block face. So the way that we have set this up is that you have to be mindful of the number of suites within the block face itself, but all of the adjacent block faces in terms of the cumulative impacts. So now let's say another application came in and they wanted to locate over here or locate over here. What we're saying is that we need to take into account where that application is happening on the specific block face and where it is in relation to other accessory suites and accessory uses on the other adjacent block faces. So there is no magic bullet, and this is where the discretion still has to be applied by the Development Authority, and whether that's the Development Officer or the Cochrane Planning Commission. But listing the criteria of what we need to consider in terms of impact on parking, the impact on the traffic generated on the street, whether it still meets the purpose of the district, those specific things that we're listing is what we will be considering when we make our decision.
To help me understand, if I was at number 50 and I wanted to apply for an accessory suite, it would be a CPC decision or a development officer decision?
Currently, under the existing regulations, it would be decided upon by the Cochrane Planning Commission. We are proposing through this bylaw to change that to the development officer to make that decision, because ultimately the development officer in our recommendation to the Cochrane Planning Commission is going through this analysis regardless, and we would be looking at this through a discretionary lens that we would apply ourselves in coming up with a recommendation. So what we're proposing is that instead of giving the recommendation to the Cochrane Planning Commission, that we are ultimately making the decision, and we are upon which the analysis of what we're already doing.
Okay, thank you. In the garden suite example, 6 feet to 8 feet, you mentioned amenity space as being the reason for the increase. Could you expand on that?
Sure.
Just more, does that mean more yard?
It does, yeah. So
Space?
amenity space, excuse me, yeah, sorry for that. Exactly. The amenity space is yard space. So there's, every lot has private amenity space, whether it's the front yard or the rear yard. So in this case, it's just would allow for that extra separation and allow for that additional yard space between the house and the garden suite.
So it would likely result in a slightly smaller garden suite being allowed on a standard lot size, just by 2 feet to, yeah, is what we're doing? Okay.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, and then 9-meter rule for your tandem parking? What's
Yes.
our standard lot size right now with R1 and R2 detached dwellings? Or isn't it 9 meters that we're
It is 9
commonly
meters.
at? Okay.
Yeah.
And so would that affect our standard developments we're doing right now? Would it then mean that you can only have one tandem parking spot? Did I understand that right?
Correct, and so this is applied for R2, where the lots can be narrower for whether it's a semi-detached or if it's a single detached, so that's the distinction. But for those lots that would be less than 9 meters, it would be restricted to one tandem parking stall. So you could have 2 that were side by side, but only 1 that could be in tandem, correct?
Thank you,
Yep.
appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Councillor Nagel.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I have a question about the, at one point in your presentation, you mentioned that as part of our growth management strategy, we're anticipating 25% of new growth to come from infill development and secondary suites. And I was just wondering, is that an official policy, or is that just something that we're expecting to happen organically from the free market?
That's a good question. So through the mayor to Councillor Nagel, this is our growth management strategy is a strategy. So it does provide direction on how we anticipate growth within the community is going to occur. So in this case, we're operating on the premise that 25% of the new growth will occur within the community through infill or through things like accessory suites, where we're increasing the number of dwelling units within the community.
So do we have an official policy that is targeting 25% of our growth to come from infill development, or is it just something you're expecting? Like, is it something that we have a policy that we want to happen?
So the growth management strategy is it's what's expected. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It is not in our policy, not that I'm aware of in our municipal development plan, but when we look at how are we going to achieve growth within the community, the strategy is to provide or to have 25% of that growth be within the community, in the existing communities.
And so if this bylaw then gives the discretionary authority to approve secondary suites to a member of the administration, they would be making decisions as to whether or not we should add more secondary suites with the lens, looking through the lens that we want 25% of our growth to come from those types of applications?
Not necessarily. I think it is something that promotes accessory suites, right? So looking at it as, yes, we want to have infill development, and accessory suites are one of the tools that we can accomplish that with. So, but we're not saying that, okay, accessory suites needs to meet that 25% target, and we have to be pretty clear on that. And so we still have to meet the intent of the neighborhood, which I mentioned earlier, and the purpose and intent of this, like an R1, for example. We have to be mindful of the impacts to ensure that it is compatible with the surrounding neighborhood and that it is appropriate to be located within that area. Now, does it support this? Yes, but not at the expense, so to speak, of not meeting that criteria.
Okay. I would like to discuss this with council more further, but it's probably beyond the scope of our public hearing because this is an entirely separate policy. But that is the end of my questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Councillor Reid?
Thanks for the presentation, Mr. Welden. I think it was really well done. Having sat on CPC for 5 years, I can appreciate why these are issues, and I really appreciate the discussion that council's had to this point and the questions they've raised. Mine's on a different slant. Can you remind me what the particulars are of the special parking zone?
Sure. Okay, so yes, so this is our special parking zone that's identified in our land use bylaw. And so the whole purpose and intent of the special parking zone is to deregulate, if you will, from a parking perspective, or to encourage development within this area by reducing the parking requirement. So parking can sometimes be challenging. And within this area, within our downtown core especially, and a little bit into our East End community, it can be a challenge in developing or doing certain types of development. So we established this area to try to encourage development within here, and one incentive is to reduce the number of required parking stalls to really, if people are not able to, or developers are not able to meet that parking requirement, that we're reducing that so that they can meet it and that the development can happen within this area. So that's the whole intent of this. And so specifically for the accessory suites and garden suites, so any application for an accessory suite or garden suite in this area, the purpose is to have a more reduced parking regulation to encourage this type of development.
So, if I can just be clear then, so the goal of the special parking zone is to increase density? Is that the objective?
Not necessarily. So it is to encourage development. So it's not just applied to, I believe it's not just applied to accessory suites. It would be applied to dwelling units within this area as well. So to encourage the type of residential development within our core. And I do believe that would align with our strategic vision that council had come up with as well. And so yeah, but this was even before, I think, the vision of council as well. But.
Mr. Devanna, you wish to weigh in?
I just wanted to ask a question. I don't normally ask questions, but in this instance, I think it would be helpful. In this area, like in the historic downtown, there's been certain types of uses, like restaurant uses, those types of things, where it's difficult to meet the parking requirements. Is a special parking zone, is it also to help businesses in that area that have small lots and normally have to park on the street?
Right. Yeah. No, it's not intended for the commercial businesses. It's only intended for residential development. So those dwelling units. Yeah.
I had a supplemental question, if I could, to my first. So that proposed parking requirement for the change for the special parking zone district, or zone, I guess, from 1.7, which I understand it was impossible to begin with anyways, and you might go back to 1999, like you did earlier, to find out why.
Yeah.
But is it reduced from 1.75 to 1 just simply because it's prohibitive to be able to get 2? Like if you were to have raised it to 2 as opposed to going down?
It is meant to be an encouragement for this type of development. So if you think about, because it's tied with the number of bedrooms, right? So if you have 2 bedrooms, under the current regulations for parking, you would need to provide 2 parking stalls. So as an incentive to have more suites within this area, which is the intent, otherwise it wouldn't be listed as a reduction in parking. To the 1.75 is what it was originally proposed as. We're keeping with the purpose and intent of this district to reduce it to 1, because if we were to keep it with the 2, then there is no incentive.
Yeah, I guess I'm troubled by that and the parking challenges that we continue to have. I mean, I get the density issue, and I appreciate the growth issue, but it just troubles me. That's just a comment, not a criticism. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, no more questions. Is there a speakers list? No? Is there anyone in the gallery that wishes to speak? Well, garden suites, accessory suites? Don't see a rush to the microphone. No other questions? Okay, we will close this public hearing. Thank you, Mr. Welden. Thank you. Moving on to the last hearing of the evening, Bylaw 4, 2020. We'll take a break after the public hearing. plural. This is Land Use Bylaw Amendment Redesignation Heartland.
No, it's good, thank you. Yeah. So before I begin, Ms. Banack sends her regrets tonight. She was not able to make it tonight. Normally it would be, she did present at first reading and she would normally be here tonight, but she was unable to make it. So I will be presenting tonight. And yes, I would like to present the Heartland Land Use Amendment, which is Bylaw 04-2020 for public hearing tonight. This map is showing the community of Heartland. To provide some context to the application, the areas subject to the land use application are highlighted in the yellow boxes. Just for context, the Highway 1A is here, obviously labeled Horse Creek Road, and the first entrance, where are we here, into the Heartland community as well. This map is showing the proposed land use amendment. The two subject areas are both proposed to change from their existing land use designation of R3, which is Residential Multi-Unit Dwellings District, to R2, which is the Residential Single and Two Dwelling District. The proposed amendment would include just over 7 acres or 2.8 hectares in total between the two parcels being proposed to change. The purpose behind this proposed change is to allow for the construction of both single and semi-detached homes under the R2 district, rather than street-oriented townhomes that were originally proposed under the R3 land use district. The change in zoning is in compliance with the adopted Heartland Stage 2 Area Structure Plan. The ASP shows both the subject areas as low-density residential. In regards to density, when the ASP was originally approved in 2015, it was proposed, or it had proposed a density for the Stage 2 lands for 8.16 units per acre. The town's municipal development plan has a policy that communities are to achieve a minimum density of 8 units per acre. Following the land use amendment in early 2019, if you recall, that moved the future RCMP site to the west and changed the commercial site to the west side of the entrance of the intersection, which I'll just kind of highlight right here. And this is the new RCMP site. To the west end of the entrance and intersection, and changed the former RCMP site and commercial sites into RM zoning, which is Residential High Density Multi-Unit Dwelling District. The proposed density increased to 8.6 units per acre at that time. The area structure plan was also amended to reflect the changes in land use and the density. This application is expected to reduce the overall units by roughly 5 in total, and thus will only have a very minor effect on the proposed density, reducing it from 8.6 units per acre to 8.5 units per acre. As the subject blocks were already shown as low-density residential in the area structure plan, and it is such a minor change to the proposed density, administration is not proposing that amendment to the area structure plan was warranted. So this slide is showing the current land uses in Heartland. R3 is shown in orange hatched coloring. When it comes to product types being provided in this community, there are still several areas of R3 where townhomes have been or will be built. In addition, several of the orange RM zoned parcels have had townhomes or fourplexes constructed on them currently. The recommended action tonight is that Council receives and considers all comments presented during the public hearing for Bylaw 4-2020. That concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you. No questions from Council. Is the applicant here?
They are,
Yep.
yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Welden.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Hello, Mayor and Council. Thank you for having us. My name is Patrick Wetter of B&A Planning Group, and I'm the applicant for this proposed redesignation. And in attendance is also Susan Henderson with Apex, who is the developer of Heartland. And we're just here to thank administration to for assisting us with this application and to answer any questions you may have with this proposal. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Council, any questions of the applicant? No? You got off easy.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone in the gallery? I don't think there's a list. Is there anyone in the gallery that wishes to speak? Okay, thank you. We'll close that public hearing as well. We'll take a 5-minute break to allow our feed to change over to the viewing audience at home, and we'll get into our regular meeting.